Hey guys, thanks for stopping by today. Today I want to talk about a build that I did for a recent contest that we held for a new board skin for playtac.com. That's the online site that the U.S. Tac Association offers free to play for anyone who has an internet connection, and you can even play a little bit offline with it. But it's kind of basic. It's had the same skins for years. Most of them are kind of pretty bad renders. So to bring these things into a new era, offered a contest, good old bribe for people to come out and kind of do our work for us, make the site look better, give you guys more options for what you can play on, how things look. And the grand prize for that contest is that I would attempt to make that digital render of a board skin into a physical object. So that's the build that I'm going to show you guys today. And to do that, first we need to make a couple upgrades to the table saw. Now I've already swapped the blade out for something with a smaller kerf, and kerf is something that we'll get into later in the video as well, but that's basically the amount of material removed during a cut. The more expensive your material, the more important it's going to be for you to minimize your losses due to the kerf. In addition to the new blade, I'm going to be adding these two pieces of kit to my table saw. Now this is a zero clearance insert, and I'll show you, I'll pop a picture up on the screen of what the factory insert looks like around the blade. So this factory insert, I mean, you look at that and you look at this, and there's quite a difference, but the one that comes on the table saw is not a design flaw. It's not like the engineers couldn't design something like this. The existing throat plate, or whatever the exact name is for that, is to allow that blade to pivot. So I mean, you can cut straight across a piece of wood, or anywhere between there and about 45 degrees over. You can adjust that blade on a typical table saw. And having that large gap there allows that blade to pivot without you having to change the throat plate to something else when you want to do that. However, the downside is that if you're working with smaller pieces of wood or trying to cut smaller pieces of plastic, anything like that, especially if you're trying to rip them down the grain, you're going to run into problems with that gap. Your pieces are going to fall into that gap or get bound up. So to address the problem of the gap, what you need is a zero clearance insert. These usually come as blanks, and then you run the saw up through them so that the only material that you have removed here from that throat plate is the width of your blade. And so they normally come in multiples, because most woodworkers have multiple saw blades that they use that have different kerfs on them. And so there's no point in having a zero clearance plate and then running a large blade through it and then switching to a small blade and having that same gap issue on a smaller scale. So let's pop one of these new guys on the table saw over there. We'll run the blade through it, and I'll show you the difference between the original and the zero clearance. The other thing that goes hand in hand with the zero clearance is going to be a thin rip jig. So this goes in kind of the T-track on your saw to lock things in place, and I'll go over how that's used later. But basically a way to get consistent cuts on the opposite side of the blade, so that you're not working up against the fence where material likes to bind and kick back at you. So without further ado, let's go look at my chicken scratch on a piece of paper. And if you guys have watched any of my stuff before, you know that I love to start things on paper. Sketching it out, making lists, things like that, just really helped me get an idea of the scope of the project and really nail down some of those key early questions. Looking at the digital render, I decided to go with African mahogany, walnut, purple heart, and then a Brazilian ebony for the border and grid lines. However, upon receiving the African mahogany, it just didn't have quite the right tone that I wanted, so I switched it out for another African wood, Bubinga. Alright, so we've got our zero clearance insert set up, and I've got my thin rip jig on here, and so now we need to set kind of what we want this cut to be. I could put it at the blade, I could line it up with one of the teeth here, put it at the blade, mark what the measurement is, and if I want my veneers on this board to be 1/4 inch thick, then I could back this off 1/4 inch, lock it down and test it. But what I'm going to do is I've got some scraps of MDF here that I use for like templates, and the beginner tack board is made from this stuff. So 3 mil is about 1/8 of an inch. I want these veneers to be about 1/4 of an inch for each of these squares, so I'm just going to double up on that. Put it beside my blade here. I'll even give it some more height. That way I can kind of offset any tipping from my hand. And again, we're using like relative measurements on this, so I don't have to have this at 1/4 inch. Since I'm going to cut them all without moving this jig, they're all going to be the same width, whether that's 1/4 inch, 3/8, you know, any kind of increment in there. But I'm going to set this up here and lock it down, and so now we should have our relative cuts coming off of here. Should be about 1/4 inch, which should be what I want. I'm gonna make a test pass with something that was cut off of an old project, just to make sure that we're coming out about right, and then we will get to work. So the way that this thin rip jig works is that it sits back here behind the blade, and you move your fence on your table saw until it contacts that bearing on the end of the thin rip jig, and then you can move this, cut it, and then move your fence again for the next cut. And since you're hitting that same spot on that bearing, this is your measurement over here, instead of having your thin piece be up against the fence where it has a lot higher chance of binding or kicking back at you, things like that. So this is the kind of the safer setup here for this type of work. All right, so let's cut this real quick, and we're just gonna measure it and see what we got. Make sure everything's locked down, but not locked down so much that it pinches. See, I can not move that against that bearing. So I'm going to back it off just a little bit, so that bearing is providing the rolling surface, but not necessarily taking all the force from this, from me pushing. All right, and grab a little tape. And if you guys can see that, that is as close to 1/4 of an inch as I'm going to get without really measuring. And after sanding and everything, it should be, you know, right at 1/4. Again, the 1/4 doesn't really matter. That measurement doesn't matter because I'm not going to move that for the rest of this project for cutting all these veneers. So they're all going to be that same relative size. And here we are with all of our veneer blanks cut. And next I marked centers on all of them so that I could put them in the laser. Now the reason for this is kind of going back to what we talked about earlier. I want the kerf to be very small in these, and a laser cutter has not a non-existent kerf, but it's like 0.1 millimeter. So instead of losing 3 mil per pass, I'm only losing 0.1. And here I made a template for the cutting. That way I'm not having to reposition the laser each time. And my idea for this template was to start small, and when I was done cutting all the squares out of that size piece, then I would cut a new template using the same board for the next size up. Another reason to use the laser is that it is a lot more precise than even a table saw. So I know that if I'm cutting a square with the laser, it's going to be perfectly square. My original plan was to cut the grid lines out with the laser as well, for the same reasons mentioned earlier. More accurate, it's even safer because I'm not having to put my fingers anywhere close to a blade. I'm just putting this inside of a enclosure, having the laser cut it, opening the enclosure, and taking out the finished product. However, my first few tries with the Brazilian ebony just didn't come out well. I ended up cleaning off more char than I was comfortable with, and it's a really tough wood. So I just took it over to the table saw, and I made all the grid lines with that same thin Rip Jig that we featured earlier in this video. And here we have our veneer. This is a very rough assembly here, just a dry fit to make sure that I liked what pieces I was starting with and could kind of judge and go from there. I did cut extras in each size so that I would be able to pick out ones that just didn't have the grain pattern I was looking for, or for some other reason didn't fit what I wanted with this board. After the dry fit, it's time to hand sand, and I really want to emphasize that it has to be hand sanding for this. If you use a belt sander or something like this, you're going to round off a corner you don't intend to, or you're going to take too much off just because it removes so much material so quickly. And that way you can correct these things like maybe a square didn't cut quite right, or it has a little char on it. And here you can see I have everything dry fit again. So it's kind of like the measure twice, cut once scenario here. You want to dry fit and then sand and dry fit and test before you put any glue on the product, because once you glue it up, there's no going back. I don't have a video of this, but here's a still of the Brazilian ebony that I used for the frame around this board. I went with just a very simple kind of miter joint on the ends, and then just a rabbet to hold in the board. And here's a dry fit with the frame, and everything seems to be lining up well. And now we can move on to the gluing stage. Then we can clamp it up overnight, and then cue the epic music. Alright, so here we are with the sanding done, and what I'm going to do now is set it out in the sunlight for a while and just see if I can get the oxidation started. Because remember, I mean, this is the exact same wood, and let me grab that piece that's waxed, and this is what it'll turn into. This is already oxidized and turned to its I guess final form. But right now, where I've cut into more of the heart of the wood, or gotten past, you can see this one has oxidized down to that point, but then I cut it, and so now we've got all this unoxidized wood showing. The grid is the same thing, so I know it looks splotchy where I have dark places and light places, but those will all oxidize to be the same color, and they should be this nice, really dark chocolate brown. So I'm going to set that out in the sun, see if I can get that process started, and then we'll get to some fishing. Yeah, we'll get into some fishing touches, some finishing touches. All right, thanks. All right, we have our sanded board. Put a little note on the back for Grappler, and then glued the felt pads on just so it's a little bit easier to pick up. It's not going to scratch tabletops, things like that. Just something I like to do on about all my boards. And now we get to see the magic happen. So, prepped our surface, wiped it with alcohol, and I'm just going to use tongue oil. The reason I like to use tongue oil on stuff like this is because it's not as plasticky feeling to the touch. So it's a very thin oil. You can build it up over a few different coats and kind of get it to the desired smoothness that you'd like. But you can, if you leave it on just a few coats, you can still feel the grain. It doesn't feel like you've put resin over top or a heavy amount of polyurethane or anything like that. So I'm a big fan, and I use it on a lot of my stuff. Very easy to apply. For the first coat, what I like to do is just kind of dump it on, and then use some gloved hands to spread it all around. And I'm going to let that sit for a little bit, come out and buff it, and then decide on how many coats I want to do after that. But you can see just how much of a color difference that made. I don't know, pick it up and drip stuff everywhere, but so I can show you guys. It's quite fantastic just getting that first coat on there, especially if you've done the work to prep your surface previous to that, so that way you know that you're getting kind of all that grain coming through. So yeah, just rub it on with your fingers, give it a little bit of time, buff it off, and decide on the next layer how many you want to do. I like to go over it multiple times just to make sure that I'm getting in all the cracks and crevices. And you may see a little bubble pop up over, here and there. Don't worry about it. It'll pop long before this stuff dries. I want to thank you guys for watching today. If you would like to support this channel further, I have a Patreon. You can buy my books up there. They're not about crafting, but they are about tack, just like about all my hobby stuff is. You can also order a commission from me, but more importantly, you can support the community by becoming a member of the U.S. Tax Association, or just joining the Discord, becoming active in the community, in the conversations that are going on, and help direct which way tack goes in the future. As always, I will leave you with pictures of what we made today. Thanks, guys.